Hey everybody, and welcome to The Year Was, the podcast all about today that gives you just enough information to effectively be that guy at the party, causing all your friends to question, hey, who invited you? Like, seriously, why are you here? I am your host, Michael Montalvo, and for the next few insert amount of time, we will swim through the river of time and find out what makes today truly unique. On this episode, we examine the events that occurred January 15th. This is something of a tricky episode to do because of the topic. On the one hand, you need to make it entertaining and you want to include jokes and references in order to break up the seriousness of it all, but on the other, well, it is a serious issue and I'm going to do my best to balance it. Today's episode is one you might want to be careful listening to as it can be graphic. I'm going to link in the description blackdahlia.web, which I use primarily for this episode, and the FBI case file provided by the FBI's Freedom of Information Act website, if you want to go look at that. Who was Elizabeth Short? And, oh wow, did you know Rose McGowan was in that movie they made about it? The one with Josh Hartnett. Whatever happened to that guy? I'm joking. I know he was in that one episode of Drunk History. Where was I? Born to Cleo and Phoebe Short, July 29th, 1924, Elizabeth Short entered our world in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. They didn't stay long, as after she was born, they moved to Medford, where her father made a living designing and building miniature golf courses until the Great Depression hit. Rather than travel to his childhood home to meet his old pastor Jim Casey, Cleo Short took the poor man's divorce route by going to get a pack of smokes. I'll be back in 10. According to History.com, mini golf became very popular during the Depression, with over 30,000 mini links popping up for the cheap, even for today's inflation rate of 25 cents. But money was harder to come by, and maybe he had made some bad bets, because after abandoning his family, he faked his death. You know what, I'm thinking about all this in 2020 money. 25 cents is a fair amount for the time. So that left Phoebe to raise 5 kids on her own, working multiple jobs and accepting public assistance until she received a letter from Cleo. The letter said that he was sorry and that he had moved to California and made a fortune in the motion picture business and wanted to bring the family to him so that they could all live happily ever after. It would be a much different story if that was true. He had moved to California and he was sorry, but he did not have a fortune, and she refused to ever see him again. So what about Elizabeth? Well, Betty, as she came to be known, grew up and was described as pretty and witty and gay, which in this instance means happy. Anna Daughtry, a Medford classmate, once said, Betty was a porcelain china doll with beautiful eyes. Her neighbor, Bob Pachios, said, and it wasn't just that she was so pretty. There are lots of pretty girls. There was something different. She was someone you liked to watch. The kind of girl boys might sneak looks at, but would get tongue-tied if she spoke to you. She looked and acted older than she was, and despite some health problems, such as asthma, she was still active. She also loved movies and wanted to be a movie star. When she grew older, her father, who apparently had kept in contact, offered his home to her until she found work. It didn't take long for her to regret this, as their relationship strained. Cleo would scold her for being lazy and a poor housekeeper and for her dating, while she, I assume, scolded him for running out on the family and being a bad guy. Duh. But I don't know this for certain. This lasted until he kicked her out in mid-1943. On the Black Dahlia website, it states she earned a reputation of not being easy, so I don't know what dating habits her dad wanted her to have. She moved to Santa Barbara and had a run-in with the law September 23, 1943, after the restaurant owners at the local hang called the cops on a bunch of rowdy kids. She, being underage, was booked Dano. She was sent back to Massachusetts and then returned to California, much like Victor Frankenstein kept returning to Geneva. She met and fell in love with Major Matt Gordon, and the two promised to marry before his untimely death. This was World War II era after all. Look, I don't know how to say this, but she went a bit crazy as she began to tell people that the two were married and that they had a baby that had died in childbirth. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what she told people. She began staying with a friend, Mark Hansen, then left Los Angeles for San Diego, where she met and befriended Dorothy French. While staying with the French family, she did housework, substandard I assume, and went out to late-night parties and more dating. She met and fell for Robert Red Manley, a salesman with a pregnant wife who claims he never strayed and indulged in the forbidden fruit that was Elizabeth Short. They saw each other off and on, and she eventually asked him for a ride to New Geneva, Hollywood, which he did, as well as pay for her hotel, before the pair went to a party on the night of January 8th, 1947. The next morning, January 9th, he had an early morning appointment. I didn't find what for. But returned around noon. Elizabeth told Robert that she was going to return to Massachusetts, and he drove her to meet her sister at the Baltimore hotel. He left her and last saw her making phone calls in the lobby. Robert Manley and the Baltimore hotel staff were the last known people to see her alive, aside from her killer. The year was 1947, and on the morning of this day, January 15th, the body of Elizabeth Short was found in a vacant lot. She had been missing for 6 days when the body was found by a local housewife and her 3-year-old daughter. Betty Bersinger saw the body and initially thought it to be trash or a mannequin. When she realized what it was, she screamed and led her daughter away to call police. The investigation was led by LA Police Department. Officers Frank Perkins and Will Fitzgerald arrived at the scene and, seeing the body, called for backup. Short's body was posed lying on her back with her arms raised above her shoulders, legs spread out. She had been cleanly cut in half just above the waist and had lacerations across her body, with her mouth being cut to extend her smile from ear to ear. That quote's from the Black Dahlia website. Police suspected her to have been tied and tortured, which was backed up by rope burns on her wrists, ankles, and neck. Despite the cuts, there was no blood on her body or at the scene, causing investigators to determine that she had been held and killed elsewhere, then cleaned, and then abandoned in the lot. Murder was not new to LA and was routinely dealt with, but because of the nature of this murder, it became a top priority. Detective Sergeant Harry Hansen and Detective Finis Brown were assigned to the case, but by the time that they had received their orders, news of the murder had already begun to spread. They took her fingerprints and sent a request to the FBI for help. It took the FBI 56 minutes to find out the body belonged to Elizabeth Short, and they did this by taking her blurred fingerprints from a primitive fax machine called Sound Photo that was used by the Herald Express to send the photos to the Bureau for identification. Because she had been arrested once and had applied for a clerk position at the commissary of the Army's Camp Cook in 1943, they already had her prints on file. In the coroner's report, they stated no sperm was present on the body. It had been washed clean and that her pubic hair had been removed by hand. I don't know what they meant with removed by hand, if it was plucked or shaved, but that's what they were able to determine. Despite all of the cuts and lacerations and, well, the official cause for death was attributed to hemorrhage and shock due to concussion of the brain and lacerations of the face. And so the investigation began. The Herald Express had information on the case, and with Short now identified, the power dynamics of the news and the police began to shift. In what feels like should have been illegal, William Randolph Hearst agreed to share any information the newspaper uncovered in their own investigation in exchange for exclusives that the LAPD would provide. Desperate for information, Captain Jack Donahue reluctantly agreed. The Herald Express assigned Wayne Sutton to locate Phoebe Short and inform her of Elizabeth's death. However, as a journalist, he knew that he would need to get information on her first. He told her Elizabeth had won a beauty contest and, in turn, was told everything He wanted to know before dropping the bombshell that was a dead daughter. But Phoebe Short did not believe him, and so the LAPD had to contact the Medford Police Department to deliver the sad news. Once news broke, the Herald Express became a hotspot for anonymous tips and reports. One report led to the recovery of a trunk of photo albums Short kept. So some of them actually proved useful in supplying information for those investigating. On January 17, 1947, a photo of Short ran on the front page of the Herald Express, giving her the name that we still associate with her today, the Black Dahlia. Side note, there was a film at the time called The Blue Dahlia, which was a murder mystery, and people remembered Elizabeth Short for her black hair, and the paper wanted to give an interesting name, so they dubbed her as the Black Dahlia. In the case of the Black Dahlia, they had two theories. Theory number 1, she never met the killer before. Theory number 2, she had met the killer before. To me, that just seems like when the news says that it's a 50% chance of rain, saying basically, it might rain, it might not. Because of the body mutilations, the police believed that it was someone she knew and had an emotional attachment to her. According to Dr. Paul DeRiver, the killer may have been a necrophiliac, saying, "It must also be remembered that sadists of this type have a superabundance of curiosity and are liable to spend much time with their victims after the spark of life has flickered and died." On January 23rd, the Examiner got a call from a man claiming to be the killer, telling the paper he was upset with the way the story was being told in the news and offering to mail them Short's belongings to back up his claim. A package arrived the next day that included Short's birth certificate, business cards, photos, and an address book with Mark Hansen's name on the cover, making him the prime suspect. Her handbag was later found that same day in a trash can a few miles from the lot and was identified by Robert Manley. Letters began pouring into the newspapers, including some from an individual dubbed the Black Dahlia Avenger. The letters were made from newspaper clippings, with one reading, "I will give up in Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." Any letters that arrived were handed to the LAPD, who had also been receiving many calls that were determined to be hoaxes. Like the Zodiac killer would later do, the Black Dahlia was taunting police. I hear what you're asking. Couldn't they have gotten fibers or fingerprints or some sort of evidence from the letters or packages? They had been washed in gasoline, and many actually gave false information. To narrow down suspects, police had to examine the scene. Because of the manner in which her body had been cut, they suspected that it was someone with medical training, much like Jack the Ripper. The LAPD contacted the University of Southern California and requested a list of medical students, which they were given, but it wasn't from that list that the first arrest was made. Robert Manley was the last person to have seen her, but upon further investigation, UGLY, he did have an alibi, and he was set free. He also passed 2 lie detector tests, so there's that. It got to the point where basically anyone Short ever knew was considered a suspect by December of 1948. In total, 192 suspects were suspected. 60 people actually confessed to the killing, but only about 22 were considered to be actual suspects. Among them were Mark Hansen, her former friend, Leslie Dwayne Dillon, a bellhop and former mortician's assistant, and Dr. George Hodel, all of whom we will talk about later. Does anyone else think it might have been the dad? I kind of get that vibe. So as with any mystery, there was talk of cover-up. Agnes Underwood, a reporter for the Herald Express, did the interview for Robert Manley, and the following morning she was taken off the Black Dahlia case, only to be reassigned to it 2 days later before then being permanently removed from it. Some believed that she was close to finding the truth and that the police who were trying to protect the killer had her removed. A grand jury was actually convened in 1949 to investigate the murder and the possibility of police cover-up. From this, Leslie Dillon was named prime suspect, but was never indicted. Why was that, you ask? Well, they had enough circumstantial evidence to name him as the killer. However, there was no concrete evidence, and he was detained illegally. A few witnesses were even willing to say that he had been in San Francisco at the time of the murder, but the grand jury did not believe the credibility of these witnesses and didn't want them to convince the jury that Dillon was innocent. In the Rolling Stone article, Has the Black Dahlia Murder Finally Been Solved? From January 2018, Dillon's name is mentioned along with another suspect. The article talks about Pugh Etwell and her book Black Dahlia Red Rose, in which she claims that the LAPD knowingly let off their main suspect because Sergeant Finis Brown, who you may remember is one of the lead investigators, was an alleged corrupt cop with ties to Mark Hansen, another prominent suspect and alleged co-conspirator in Short's death. According to Buzz Williams, he overheard his father Richard Williams, an investigator on the Black Dahlia case, and Con Keller, another investigator, say, they believed Dillon had orchestrated the murder with two other men, Mark Hansen and a mysterious figure named Jeff Connors, whom investigators had originally written off as a figment of Dillon's unhinged imagination. More on him in a moment. My dad thought Leslie Dillon was the killer, Williams told Rolling Stone. Con Keller thought Dillon was present for the murder, but that Mark Hansen was the killer. In the Madera Tribune, dated January 13, 1949, it states that Connors, whose real name may have been Artie Lane, was arrested. Lane worked for Columbia Pictures and may have been familiar with Short due to her desire to be an actress. However, there is some debate to this, as Grace Allen, his ex-wife, claimed he was working the night of the murder and that the next morning he warned her not to go out alone. So what was the reason for the murder, you ask me? It's alleged that Short became aware of a hotel robbery scam that they were all involved in, and that was why she had been killed. Don't worry, I hear you. What hotel robbery scam? Apparently, Dillon was a member of a gang that would get jobs as bellboys and then find out where the safe was, only to quit, and then later return to rob the place. Short was involved with a number of these members and was killed, I guess, because she was too close to the whole thing. Maybe she was going to turn them in. I don't know. Etwell went on to say that she believes that the men killed Short at the Astor Motel where Dillon had stayed, and the motel owners, Henry and Dora Hoffman, admitted to finding a cabin covered in blood and fecal matter on January 15, 1947. Guests at the motel also witnessed a woman who resembled Short and a man resembling Hansen at the motel prior to this discovery. Another theory was brought forth by Steve Hodel, whose father George was a suspect. In the Guardian's article, I Know Who Killed the Black Dahlia, My Own Father, from May 2016, the younger Hodel said, he found a photo album tucked away in a box. The album was small enough to fit into his palm and was bound in wood. Inside were the usual photos of family, but towards the back, a young woman with curly black hair caught his eye. My God, that looks like the Black Dahlia. And over the years, he began to dig. So we know by the photos that Short was cut in half. She had been given a hemicorporectomy. She had been given a hemicorporectomy, which is a procedure that slices the body in the only spot one does not need to cut bone. It was a procedure taught in the 1930s, or when George Hodel would have been in medical school. The letters written to the police from the Black Dahlia Avenger, who claimed to be the murderer, resembled the elder Hodel's writing as well. A handwriting expert determined it was inconclusive. Among the other evidence was a receipt for 10 5-pound bags of concrete, the same type police had found near the body, which I only found out because I read this Guardian article about the concrete. As of the date of the article, Hodel's investigation has been the only one to warrant official acknowledgement from the DA's office. So what happened? Who did it? We don't know. There was a mystery in town, but no one could call the coolest pup around. The case is cold and remains one of the most famous unsolved cases of the 20th century. Because of the time that has passed, it is unlikely that we will ever find out what really happened, and it remains an unknown. The Black Dahlia has spawned many examinations in the form of YouTube, books, documentaries, movies, news segments, bands, blogs, vlogs, clogs, and podcasts. And I struggled with it for some time as to whether I should do one. Did I have anything I could add? Was I going to magically solve a case that has been unsolvable for over 60 years? The short answer is no. The long answer is no way. We will always wonder what truly happened, and some of us may even dream of finding that lost bit of evidence to break the case. But it all began on this day in 1947. That was a terrible closing line. The end. That's going to do it for us today. If you like this episode and want to hear more, give us a rate and a review. That helps me out and helps me steer this in a direction that is hopefully good for all. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can find the audio version on your podcast app of choice, links in the description. You can find me on social media and at YouTube at the Apple Cider Club. And as always, I want to thank the Tim Kreitz Band for our musical theme, and thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.